more about LGBTQ plus experiences and gender is, there's a lot to unpack. There's a lot to learn and discover. And so we are so excited to be taking a look at masculinity tonight. So just some quick housekeeping. So this meeting is being recorded right now. And if you are not comfortable being on camera, I'm going to ask for you to turn your camera off now. And if you so your voice will be recorded as well, and the audio will be recorded. And if you would still like to ask a question, but you don't want to be on camera, or you don't want to be on mic, you can send a question to me in the private chats, and we will have the question asked during the presentation. And without further ado, I'm going to welcome the St. Mary's College Gender and Women's Studies Feminist Theory class for Mindful Masculinity, and take it away. Thank you so much.
So welcome everyone and good evening. Thank you again for joining us today for this workshop, again on mindful masculinity. I want to introduce myself. My name is Faith and my pronouns are she and her. I want to thank you again for being here this evening. Your presence is greatly appreciated, especially during these trying times. In these trying times, while we are still waiting for election results / numbers, we would like to thank everyone for being present tonight. I would also like to say you are welcome to use the chat to speak with presenters if you are not comfortable speaking out loud. Also, using the reactions like hand claps or smiley faces, thumbs up can also be used. I also just encourage you to be respectful, especially while the presenter is presenting. Also, we would greatly appreciate it if all cameras can be on during the workshop, unless told otherwise. Lastly, the safe space portion of this workshop will go over further guidelines. And lastly, I encourage everyone to participate and to enjoy the workshop. Have a good evening, everyone. Next slide. Next slide.
Hello, everyone. My name is Akpeche Bawo, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm going to share tonight's goals and objectives. So the main goal is to really inform everyone about the concept of masculinity, especially in today's society. So we're going to specifically talk about toxic masculinity, what it is, who it affects, and how society contributes to its concept. We're also going to discuss the needed steps to help dismantle the stereotypes around masculinity, and also how to combat toxic masculinity. And considering the time period we're in right now, we're also going to try and get everyone to understand the pandemic's effect on masculinity as well. And then the main objective for tonight is to connect academic study to everyday practice and discuss operational definitions to create understanding moving forward. Next slide, please.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Bryn and my pronouns are she, her. And I'm just gonna go over some ground rules that we have so that we can create this space a safe one where everyone feels comfortable to share and learn equally. So first, we're going to ask that everyone checks their assumptions at the metaphorical door so that because we don't know people's stories, and that moves us into our next point. We just want to be respectful. We don't know everyone's stories, and we want to be respectful of privacy and confidentiality. And we want to emphasize that it's okay to disagree, but we don't want to debate because that doesn't create a productive dialogue. And we also want to ask that everyone self-monitors because it's important that everyone has a space within this dialogue. And then we also want to emphasize the use of I statements because personal experiences are unique and generalizing isn't representative. And then finally, we just ask that we apply these same ground rules to any chat use, just emphasizing again, being respectful. And we also want to acknowledge that today is an incredibly stressful day for everyone for all reasons. And we want to acknowledge that this workshop covers a pretty difficult topic. So I'm gonna hand it over so that we can take a moment to ground ourselves in just a peaceful meditation.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to be leading our meditation today, just a soft, little calm moment that we can take just to start us off. My name is Zoe Ricker. My pronouns are she and her, and let's get started. Okay, so I hope you're in a comfortable position. You may be at your desk, on your couch, maybe you're on the floor, wherever and however you are. Let's all go ahead and close our eyes. I want you to take a moment, take your hands off your keyboard, rest them on your lap or next to you. Let your tongue drop from the roof of your mouth. Your eyes relax. Drop your shoulders. Breathe in. Breathe out. I just want you to know that today we're here in a safe space. You can share anything you'd like, however you'd like. In the chat, in your breakout rooms, maybe just write things down. Just hope you take away what you need to today. It's a stressful time, no matter who you are or where you are. Breathe in. Breathe out. Thank you guys for coming today. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for taking this time to close your eyes and just relax. Now we're going to get started with a little bit of our workshop here. We're going to do some activities and get to know each other. You can go ahead and click the next slide.
Hi, everyone. My name is Tia. My pronouns are she and her. Zoe, I was going to ask, are we going to do the icebreakers now, or should I continue with the presentation?
Oh, yes. I thought somebody else was in charge of those. I'm so sorry. Yeah, there should be a space or a slide for that. Yeah. Oh, there it is. I think that was somebody in the next group.
I can take over.
Okay.
Okay, so I think before we get started, we're going to sort ourselves into smaller breakout rooms, and we're going to start by asking 2 questions. So the first one, I will write it in the chat, but just asking everyone what their favorite midnight snack is. And then the second question that we're going to ask of you is, what are your general impressions? What's the first thing you think of when someone says toxic masculinity? So I'll write that into the chat below, and then it'll probably take a few moments to get us sorted into those smaller groups.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, we're doing a quick icebreaker. Sorry, my dog.
Yes, I tried to fix the breakout room and I got booted out of the meeting.
That's okay. Yeah, they just asked me real quick to sort people into rooms, and I didn't know how many rooms, so I just went with 2 people at a time. So we can do the icebreaker. So what's your favorite
That's
midnight?
awesome. My favorite midnight snack is Ben & Jerry's cookie dough ice cream. I just
Ooh,
think
that's
it's
a good
delicious.
one.
Particularly the little like pint, the perfect personal size to finish in
Good
one night.
size, yes. I too enjoy ice cream. I'm going to give people a 1-minute warning here in a second. But I like the Reese's Klondike bars because those are like the perfect size for one.
Yeah, I'll eat one.
Yeah, I'll eat more than one as well. And so what do you think of what's your first thought when you hear toxic masculinity?
My first thought when I hear toxic masculinity is I think of mean and aggressive men who try to be really macho and strong.
Yeah, I kind of think of like domineering, trying to dominate, mansplaining, those sorts of things. I kind of think of those because I think that permeates into a whole lot of other things as well. Hello. Oh, I think everybody's coming back in. Well, it's nice to get to know you, Danny.
Thank you. You as well.
Yes, I'm ready. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Tia. My pronouns are she and her. And now we're going to get into theories and concepts. And the first theorist that we have is Judith Butler and her theory of gender performativity. So Butler's a contemporary gender theorist. And here I have a quote from her 1988 essay, Performative Acts and Gender Constitution. Gender reality is performative, which means, quite simply, that it is real only to the extent that it is performed. So, when the idea of gender performance was introduced, many people were unclear about what was actually meant and heavily critiqued Butler. What Butler meant was that gendered behaviors are taught, and this is especially true during childhood. For a long time, the only options for gender for children were within the binary. And as children, we receive these messages of what is acceptable for us to do as boys and what's acceptable for us to do as girls. And these taught behaviors are rooted very much so in societal gender expectations and gender norms. And like many people say, children's minds are like sponges, and these gendered, often heteronormative lessons are absorbed by children and shape most childhood experiences. These societal norms are either implicitly or explicitly taught through family, friends, teachers, social media, television shows, formal education, and many other outlets that shape our minds. And these lessons and expectations follow us into adulthood. Would anyone like to share some gendered behaviors that they were taught, or any messages that they received as children or young adults that combated gender expectations? Feel free to use the chat or unmute yourself. So when I was younger, like I used to play outside a lot, like in the dirt. Like I was the kid who like made mud pies and like took the little cherry things off the like bushes. And I was taught that like little girls weren't supposed to play in the dirt. That's like what boys do and stuff like that. Yeah, I think that's very common. Like what type of play is acceptable for children based on their gender. So yeah, that's definitely very common.
In the group chat, someone said, Derek Patty says, guys don't cry.
Yes. And then we have another message from Kevin Schultz. Boys are only allowed to express any emotion through happiness or anger. Yes.
In the same way, I think when I was growing up, I was told that I couldn't be super angry. And I think still today, my response when I'm angry is more to like show like sadness.
HR said boys play with boys' toys and not girls' toys. Yes. I was actually having a discussion about, you know, like the difference between like action figures and dolls. Like they're essentially the same thing, but they're given different titles, and one is viewed as more masculine and acceptable for boys. And one is more so for little girls. Going back to the comments, because emotion and expression of emotion for different genders is coming up a lot. That is very prominent, just I feel like throughout our media, especially in television shows where women are, you know, supposed to, like you said, Elizabeth, stay very composed, not have too many outbursts of anger, keep that composure, and men, but it is okay for women to cry as a expression of anger. And men and boys are not supposed to cry. They're supposed to be the strong ones, or like, you know, like the solid ones, the emotionally kind of unexpressive in emotions outside of anger and happiness, as stated before. Examples for myself, I was always taught that men were supposed to be the breadwinners of a household and provide for families, which was more so the teachings from my grandmother. But my mom was a single mom, and she was, you know, providing for my sister and I herself. And so she kind of combated what my grandmother would try to teach me. So that sort of like generational gap there, and just their views, especially with my mom being a single mom, she did receive like a little bit of judgment from my family and all that, but she definitely told me like it's okay to be independent. You know, it's okay to, you know, depend on someone, but also have, you know, enough of your own and be able to take care of yourself. Danny shares that boys and men cannot care about fashion. Yes, that is a very gendered industry and entity in society. Kevin Schultz shares, men are rewarded for sexual promiscuity and attacked for abstinence. Women are attacked for both. Yes, I've actually had written an essay last semester about that same idea of men looking at sex for pleasure and women looking at sex for more commitment-based and intimate-based relations, and just how the expectations for those binary genders are explicitly expressed like almost everywhere. Thank you everyone for sharing. Oh, we have one more from Faith Young. Oh, two more, sorry. Boys and men cannot get manicures or pedicures because it is considered feminine. And Ashanti says yes, which seems bizarre because they are super sharp during 2020 Fashion Week. Oh, yeah. Yes, sort of what I would consider pedicures and manicures, like just general self-care, just like a little bit of pampering, which I think everyone deserves every once in a while. So, but it is a very gendered activity. Any last comments? I don't want to miss anyone. Okay, well, thank you everyone who participated and shared with us. Dr. Whiteman, you can go to the next slide. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Danny, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Ashley, and my pronouns are she, her. And then kind of going off of Butler's theory, she also explains that gender identity is caused by gendered acts. And specifically, these acts are continuously constituting the identity. And like a prominent example of this within the pandemic is the act of wearing a mask being seen as feminine, and it also illustrating that men do not have a strong immune system. In fact, like according to a survey reported by the BBC, it was reported that men have higher rates of not wearing a mask, and it was concluded that men feel that wearing a mask was shameful, not cool, and a sign of weakness. They also concluded that this was correlated with the higher male death rates. So essentially, men being less inclined to wear a mask means they're more at risk for contracting the virus. And essentially, this provides that the act of wearing a mask is essentially gendered, and yeah.
We're also going to talk about hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is a type of masculinity that scholar R.W. Conwell describes as embodying a currently accepted strategy. This means that men maintain dominant social roles over other gender identities. For example, the dominance of heterosexual men and the inferiority of homosexual men. Additionally, hegemonic masculinity means that men fall into gendered stereotypes to prove their masculinity to the world. Some examples of these stereotypes may include men in government, in the military, or men who are top-level business professionals. Next slide, please. So we are also going to talk about identity and representation. So scholars Kimberly Crenshaw and Gloria Anzaldúa have two gender theories which focus on the multiple categories of a person's identity. Kimberly Crenshaw coined the term intersectionality, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard. And this relates to the interconnected nature of a social categorization such as race, class, and gender as they apply to an individual or a group. Gloria Anzaldúa's borderland theory claims that there are borders between our identity with a focus on the various borders, including those of our race, gender, and identity. So how does this all relate to masculinity? Well, in regards to these theories, men may feel as though they are in between two borders or have multiple intersections of themselves, which society urges men not to claim. Toxic masculinity inhibits men from learning how to claim their intersections or their borders. Now I ask that you all take a moment to think about your own identity or the identities of people in your life, and how might intersectionality or borderland theory apply to these identities. So we'll just take about a minute or less, and then we're going to go into a group discussion. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to have a big group discussion with all of us, so no need for breakout groups. The three takeaways are think, feel, say, and do. So we'll go ahead and keep this slide up while we have discussion so you can reference back and forth. But take a moment, as well as observing your identity, and think what makes you think of masculinity. So this is a little bit of a check-in from our previous discussion. How does masculinity make you feel? And what might be things that people say and do that are examples of toxic masculinity? So feel free to use the hand raise function or unmute your mic if needed. For those who don't know, the hand raise function, if you go to the bottom of your screen and click participant, you can press raise hand. So please, anyone who would like to go first, please share. I see that Kevin wants to say that. Oh, Kevin, would you like to go?
Yeah, I mean, so in response to the first prompt, the think aspect, I mean, this is something that was on my mind in the moments even leading up to this workshop, but there's a few of us on here that are either social work students or actual, social work professionals, and, some of us that work in the mental health field, but masculinity, I guess like I can view it as a barrier at times, like in a treatment setting, because you have to overcome some of this to, when working with a man at times, to get them to a level of comfort to open and divulge aspects of their life. And, that openness and honesty and willingness to be vulnerable is, the first step in any sort of productive outcome. That was the main thing that popped into my mind there.
Yes, thank you. And that's awesome. And I think even what you said makes me think about the Borderlands theory, which I briefly discussed. You said that it's a barrier, and barriers are like borders. Men feel like they can't cross over. They have to be super masculine or they're not, and they're just stuck in this in between where they can't express that maybe they have these emotions that they want to share with others. So I think you make a great point. Thank you so much for sharing. Elizabeth, you were going to say something. Would you like to go?
I was just going to mention when I was talking with my partner a little while ago, going off of the what makes you think about masculinity. I know that this isn't true on I know obviously quite a few men, and this isn't true on a personal basis really, but the first thing that pops in my mind when I think of masculinity is like the man, the CEO, that's kind of douchey, and like he's just like showing his power, and unfortunately like that's the image that I have in my head, when in reality, like the men that I know one-on-one, they aren't necessarily like that. They actually do have feelings. It's just the expectation makes that image pop in my mind right away.
Yes, definitely. Thank you for sharing. And I know that what you described as your view of masculinity, a lot of that we see in media representation. And I know we're going to discuss masculinity in the media later, so you're definitely setting us up in the right direction. Thank you. So does anyone have more to share about maybe how does masculinity make you feel? And obviously there are no wrong answers, and please remember to use I statements.
I am muted. I cannot figure out how to use the raise hand function. I am not that familiar with Zoom. I'm so sorry. But this is addressing like how does masculinity make you feel? I think it can go kind of like either way. Like sometimes when it comes to masculinity, like sometimes I feel protected, especially like with like the men in my life, like my grandpa, like my uncles, like growing up, like and just now, like just that sort of like sometimes overbearing, but like it's rooted in love type of protection. But then sometimes like in the workplace, masculinity can make me feel a little bit inferior, like if something happens and then I'm kind of like, oh, like, did I overreact? Or, like, it's kind of like, well, I didn't mean it like that, or, anything like that. And then I think too, sometimes in the workplace and in school, and this may not be intentional, but the sort of like mansplaining happens. And it's like, this really like gets on my nerves when men are like, well, sweetie, if you do it like this, and it's kind of like, okay, sweetie, like, can you just kind of like clear this like one part that I'm not getting up or something like that. So there are positives to it there, and there are sort of like shortcomings of masculinity and how it can be interpreted, I feel like, by the people on the other end receiving it.
Yes, absolutely, Tia. Thank you for that response. And I think you bring up a great point that masculinity makes you feel uncomfortable, especially in the workplace. The fact that you need to correct men, it shouldn't have to happen. Am I right? So identifying these feelings is so important so that we can help others and redirect them, because they may not know that they're displaying this toxic behavior. Ashanti, would you like to go next? And then Elizabeth Day.
Oh, sure. I think I pressed the raise hand button by mistake, but I still have a lot to share. I think when I think of masculinity, I think of the men in my life, like whether that's my father, my cousin, or my boyfriend, and they have a hard time like talking about emotions. And I think that stems from their childhood where they were forced to not talk about their emotions. And I like to get in people's head. I like to know what's going on. Like, can you talk to me, please? So it's like a barrier after barrier to get them to talk to me about almost anything. I think as I got older, my dad opened up more to me, but even then, he's like a brick wall.
Thank you for sharing. That's awesome. Elizabeth?
You got to unmute yourself.
That first. Okay. Some things that I find myself trying to like recognize and prevent is that a lot of the times I'll feel hurt by someone and then I immediately go to this place where like men are trash, men are this, men are that. And then I like am reinforcing this idea that like all men need to act this specific way or men have these traits. And I have made an effort to stop putting everyone in these boxes because it's hurtful for everyone when we make these like broad statements like, oh, well, like men are trash.
That is a great point. I know a lot of people in our generation, women specifically, say that term a lot. I myself, so I think you bring up a great point about us like not having to put people in these boxes because then we are just giving into the stereotype. Faith Young, do you want to go? And then Dr. Wagman wants to go next about sharing how they feel about masculinity.
Masculinity, to me, it's kind of a sticky situation is how I think of it. Because like my partner, he was taught like how to be a man, quote unquote, or like the stereotypes on how to be a man. And so like me being me, I'm a very empathic person. And I love feelings. Like I love when you talk about feelings. That's the best thing. And so like if something's wrong, I'm like, no, something's wrong. Like tell me. And like I'm the type of person to like force it out of you. Because like I prefer if you would just show your emotions. To me, it's not unmanly. Like I feel like you're more of a man if you do show your emotions. And that's just how I feel towards masculinity. And like I just like try to encourage him to like show his emotions, and like even if it's not with me, like showing it with his friends, just so that he can at least share it and not build up that aggression. So yeah.
I think it's great that you share your feelings with others like that. Thank you, Faith. HR, you said that you wanted to go. Excuse me, not Professor Wagner.
That's okay. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to hear all your points of view surrounding masculinity, because we all have our own ideas and thoughts, so it's great to hear those. But like for me personally, I feel like masculinity, for me, it's self-defined. I try to figure out the good parts of quote unquote masculinity, and I take those with me, but I also take, quote unquote feminist femininity with me as well. And I think that's where, at least for me, it's kind of difficult because masculinity is that box. We're talking about these boxes that we're putting people in, and to try to navigate within those boxes, especially when you don't necessarily feel a lot of the masculine traits, or you don't necessarily buy into all of the masculine traits. I was, as a very young kid, I was a very sensitive child. So crying was not a big deal for me. I would do it all the time, but I was always told, don't be a sissy, don't cry, boys don't cry, buck up, come on now, and I played with my cousin's dolls. I enjoyed doing that, not the action figures. I had those too, but the dolls, so it's like, it's kind of difficult, especially for, and not all men, but for me particularly, growing up as a boy and now a man, trying to navigate that world of idealized masculinity, the toxic and the good of what that looks like, and trying to figure out how you fit into all of that can be really difficult. So that's, yeah.
Those are some very great points. Thank you for sharing. That's so important. I think like having this discussion, having this workshop really does open us up to all of those ideas. And that's why we're doing this. So we can all think, and how can we help others? So thank you, that's so awesome. Would anyone else like to share about how masculinity makes you feel, or some other examples of toxic masculinity? I just don't want to miss anyone before we move on.
I think just to piggyback on what everyone said today, when I think about masculinity in a nutshell, I look at my role models, and I was very blessed to have positive role models who, looked at me as for an individual and not just from my gender role. My grandpa and my dad were very empathetic and sensitive people. So that was encouraged for me. It was my friends that told me that I couldn't do that and I couldn't wear pink and do all of these things. So when I think about, how does it make me feel? I've always broken outside of these norms and kind of these limitations that we're supposed to have. And I think that was really well said, HR. And I always tell people, like, you're an individual, salt and pepper it and, season it so that it works for you, and it tastes good and you like it. And, I encourage that from people.
Thank you for sharing. And I'm so glad that you're blessed with great role models. I think role models are very important for us to identify in our lives, especially in a positive way. And how can we be role models for other people? Zoe said that self-defined was a really good term from HR, so thank you. You should take charge of your masculinity and femininity, however you define them, and be kind to yourself. Thank you, Zoe. Does anyone have any last remarks before we go on to the next section? Nope. All right, so next slide, please, and the other group will take over.
Hi, my name is Ashanti. My pronouns are she, her.
I'm Mia. My pronouns are she and her.
Hi, I'm Sarah. My pronouns are she and her. And I'm Anastasia, and my pronouns are she, her.
So when you hear the words masculinity in society, can you all share what you think comes to mind? Or put it in the group chat too.
When men hold doors open, I feel like that's a big thing.
To me, when I think of masculinity in society, what I've seen is it's something that constantly has to be proved. Act or being a certain way, acting a certain way, feeling a certain way.
Yeah, I think that when I think of masculinity in society, it's always what other people perceive and necessarily what you believe masculinity should be for yourself. Because one, you're the man, so like that makes much more sense. Professor Wagner says something that is always in flux and changing. And I think that can also be where a buildup of anxiety comes from when performing like gender, because it's always changing. So you have to conform to this and conform to that. So I think that's where buildup and confusion about who you are comes into play. Does anybody else want to share or utilize the group chat?
The word I thought of just now is thinking of like always forgivable. The behavior is always forgivable. Things are always forgivable because boys are boys and that's how it works and it's okay, but girls have to meet certain standards. So it's always this get away with it essentially.
Oh, we have a lot. So HR says a set of expectations. Casey says, I think of men being strong and assertive. Appendage said, I think of society hold on / expectations of what gender should be. Anything that is not feminine because masculinity is usually in opposition to femininity. Those are all good. Thank y'all for sharing. I think those are all good examples of how masculinity is constructed in society. And right now we're going to talk about that in the lens of politics and economics, entertainment, and family and friends. Can I get the next slide, please?
So I am talking about masculinity in economics and politics. So I included these photos because I thought they perfectly show that. Masculinity is especially prevalent in politics right now. And I'm sure we can all think of an example where we have seen like masculinity in politics. One of the biggest examples that came to mind that happened quite recently was in 2018 when Brett Kavanaugh had his confirmation hearing, and like as pictured in this picture, he was very angry, like definitely lost his temper and his face was flushed and he was making faces like that like throughout the whole hearing and raising his voice. And I just thought of how, like, if a woman were to do that, like a woman politician specifically, it would have been a lot less acceptable and there would have been a lot more backlash, and probably they would question her ability to be on the Supreme Court. And another example in politics is that women's looks are often talked about more, and that causes them to be like objectified and then be seen as like less competent and less human. And men tend to be more respected in politics because they are associated with power and strength, which like goes along with masculinity. So clearly, stereotypes are pretty common in politics and economics. So moving on to like the economics part, there's the idea of the male machine, and it's commonly referred to, and it means that a man has complete control over his surroundings without needing the help of others. And this attitude can detach men from meaningful relationships and create hostility and overall competitiveness in the workplace. The work first attitude facilitates toxic behavior that is conflated with masculinity. Then there's the idea that masculinity contest culture, which also relates to the idea of the male machine. And this encourages one to not show vulnerability and to let nothing interfere with work. And this culture like leads to exhaustion and depression by not allowing for a work-life balance. So my group decided to think of ways to combat and challenge these stereotypes. And we just said that this can include connecting with your coworkers better and addressing one's own biases and prejudices, whether that be like gender or anything like that, and then creating a healthy balance of work and home life, as well as advocating for equality, even if it's not equality for yourself, maybe like equality for the people you work with. And then also holding male and female politicians to the same standards. And then I was just wondering if anyone wanted to add like an example in politics or like economics where they've seen masculinity in the chat, or you can just speak.
I think for me personally, speaking on the economic side of it, there is a definite correlation between, you know, how much money and power and prestige you hold and how you are perceived as being masculine or how much of a man you are. I think the other thing too is tied to economics, is the resistance of a lot of men sometimes, especially if they're in an opposite sex relationship. You know, they sometimes have that feeling of being emasculated because their girlfriend, their wife, their partner makes more money than they do, and that's not something that's supposed to happen. Or if you have a female boss and you're a male, there's some power dynamics there that, you know, you may not respond to your female boss the same way you would if she were a male boss. So, you know, I was lucky. I grew up with a lot of, really strong female role models. So I learned to respect women and had no problems with female bosses ever. And actually almost, my favorite bosses and best bosses I've ever had have been women. So, that's my personal journey on that, but I definitely have seen it in the workplace. And I know people who kind of struggle with that as well, so.
Yeah, that's a great point you bring up about how like men are expected to make more than like, especially in like heterosexual relationships, like they're expected to make more money in the relationship. And this brings me back to this great gender and politics class that I took a few semesters ago. And in the book we were reading, it showed that like domestic violence was more prevalent in households where the female made more money than the man. And it goes with like the man feeling emasculated because he wasn't making as much money or less, or yeah. Yeah, Faith said the fact that the United States currency is all men. So on the pennies and the dollars and yeah, that is true. Anything else?
Oh, I was gonna say, I think that like the idea of masculinity always somehow like resists to embrace femininity, and I always wonder like why, like what is that, like where does that come from? Like if anybody have any ideas to share, like at least to try to talk about that, because I don't even know myself, so at least we can open up the floor for that.
Well, I think what was mentioned earlier about men being taught to, reject their other identities, to not claim those identities, because being anything other than a man is perceived as less than. It's perceived as, being not as much of a man, therefore not as much of a person. And I think that that really, that part right there really hits the nail on the head on, embracing our identities, embracing our differences, and that there's not just one way to be a man. Yeah, I think men are absorb this messaging that they have to be a certain way to be a man, to be a person, and being any other way, especially when we think about folks who identify as queer, that's essentially when you identify as queer, you're being something other than what a man is supposed to be, right? But we know that's not true. And I think embracing those identities is really, I think, the solution we should be striving for.
Yeah, to kind of go off of what Michael was saying, especially within the queer community, there is a lot of pressure and a lot of shaming of those who have a lot more feminine qualities about them. You know, men who like to wear makeup or may not necessarily dress in masculine clothing. There is definitely, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with masculine for masculine, that kind of behavior, and a lot of bottom shaming. You know, it's like if you're on the receiving end of a sexual act, then you're not really a man. You're put in that common ass question that, you know, straight people like to ask gay couples, like, who's the woman? And it's like, well, neither of us are. That's why we're in a gay relationship. So, you know, I think, you know, there's always been this idea that, you know, women and girls are less than, you know, that's why you hear those, don't throw like a girl, you run like a girl. I'm like, you know, I'd love to run like a girl. Florence Griffin Joyner, she was a great runner. I would love to be able to run that fast. You know, it's like, that's not, to me, that's not always put down, but that's usually used as a pejorative. You know, you know, if you don't perform well, then you're performing like a girl, or you scream like a girl because you get scared, or things like that. And it's like, we use that far too often as a pejorative, because you never hear, you know, you run like a man, you know, or you throw like a man, and mean it as something demeaning.
I think you brought up a great point about how like a lot of straight people will ask like a homosexual couple, like, or a gay couple, like, who's the woman? Like, it doesn't have to be, like, you both can have masculine and feminine traits. Like, no one has to be the woman. Like, you both are men or you both are women. And yeah.
I think it's so interesting because my best friend came out to me over the summer as bi, and he has a boyfriend now. And they always get asked like, so who's the top and who's the bottom? And for him, he always, okay, this is probably too much information, but he tries to maintain his power and privilege by being the top, because he thinks that being the bottom is like submissive. And I think that comes from the desire to maintain power in that dynamic of relationship, which I think is crazy because y'all in a relationship together. So be nice to each other. So yeah, I do think that the idea comes from wanting to maintain power. And as far as economics, to maintain privilege among those who already have it.
Yeah, that is a good point. Like, it's a relationship, so no one should feel the need to have like power over another, but that's the way it is. Well, hopefully not. Hopefully it'll change. But if no one else has anything to say, I think we're good for the next slide, Professor Wagman. So this slide is about the entertainment industry, which I'm sure we all can think of a billion examples of how masculinity is portrayed in the media, like TV shows, books, movies, commercials, like even billboards. So it plays a crucial role. The entertainment industry plays a crucial role in how we perceive the world. There's pretty much no way to avoid it, and our dependence on it is only growing. Masculinity is heavily spread through these outlets and can continue desensitizing us to toxic masculinity. As we see in this Burger King commercial, I Am a Man. It mocks the 70s feminist icon song, I Am a Woman, and shows themes of masculinity. And then Professor Wagman, if you could play the video on the left. Are we having technical difficulties?
I think we're going to close out the presentation and then open up the link through there. I think we're having some issues doing it directly through the presentation.
If you want it, if it'd be helpful, you can like give a summary of what the video.
I can do that. So the commercial on the left was a Burger King commercial, and I'm so disappointed it won't play, but it basically shows a lot of themes of toxic masculinity and how like the guys in the commercial are like degrading women, and it shows their like physical strength and just makes like a lot of comments like that. And then for the commercial on the right, it was the Gillette commercial where it showed like, I guess, the positives of masculinity and like men showing their emotions and things like that. Oh, here it is.
Michael, we're not getting any sound. When you share it, make sure that you click on the, there's a couple of buttons at the bottom so that the audio comes through.
I am man, hear me roar. The number's too big to ignore, and I'm way too hungry to settle for chick food. Cause my stomach's starting to growl, and I'm going on the prowl for a Texas double whopper. Man, that's good. Oh yes, I'm a guy. I'll admit I've been fed quiche. Wave tofu, bye-bye. Now it's the Whopper beef I reach. I will eat this meat till my innie turns into an outie. I am starved. I am incorrigible. And I need to stop a big burger, beef, bacon, jalapeno, good thing down. I am hungry. I am incorrigible. I am mad.
The Texas double whopper. Eat like a man, man.
And so I guess we're gonna ask, does anyone have like any reactions or anything they want to point out from that video? I know there's a lot going on, so.
So like just a quick question. So like at the end it said Texas. So like was this only shown in Texas? Because I don't remember seeing this in Indiana. Like that's just like my point of view. Like
I think it's really old, but oh, and here we have the other video, and then we can continue talking about. Or we can talk about the Burger King. I'm honestly not sure. It might have only shown in Texas, but I think it's pretty old, and I just don't know.
I don't remember it because I probably wasn't even born then. I probably was like 2 or 3, so that's probably why I don't remember it. But when those men decided to throw the car over into the truck, I guess that was a representation of their strength. I don't know. I don't guess, but probably not.
I think it was a minivan, and I think it was rejecting the idea that women drive minivans to take children around because that's their job, and I'm a man, I don't do that.
hope there were no kids in that minivan.
Oh, probably not, no.
Okay, because
They probably went to jail.
It also shows how the men are always, being trained to use violence and destruction to kind of express any sort of emotion, whether it's destruction, whether it's like throwing over the wall or whatever, and they're trying to, denounce it. That commercial was shown around the whole country, and the fact you weren't born when it came out makes me feel really sad. But this is one commercial in a series of commercials, not like a series about this theme, but like per se. But Burger King has had a history of being a little out of touch, out of the pocket as far as their stuff goes. If an old commercial that was a woman, presumably a woman, eating a chicken sandwich, and was shown to be very much like a fellatio, basically. They're not. They have a bad history. They've changed their ways, but they've had a bad history in the mid 2000s.
Thanks, Derek, for sharing. Another thing I noticed from the Burger King commercial is like they kind of even gendered food. Like meat is seen as like super masculine and like manly, quote unquote. And like there were no women in that commercial who were like chomping on like a burger.
Well, because that's unladylike.
Yeah.
Women don't eat.
Yeah.
Women are supposed to eat salads because they're always on a diet, right? Because they want to keep that nice trim figure. So that's the message that's being sent out there. It's like when he says no chick food, he's hitting a salad. It's like, yeah.
Unless they're Paris Hilton or Kim Kardashian and they're in bikinis and being sexualized.
Right. Thank you, Hardee's.
This is the other Kevin, he, him, but yeah, so I had forgotten about this. Big disappointment there, but yeah, it just one of y'all mentioned earlier about the idea of men and masculinity as being forgivable and everything, and I think like that almost applied to this as well, because what I was immediately reminded of is they're ripping off that song, and not doing anything good with it, and I was reminded of All Lives Matter versus Black Lives Matter, and just stealing like that movement and the message and everything for their own comical gain. So
That is a very good point, and I'm glad you made that connection. If no one else has anything to say about this commercial, we can watch the Gillette commercial. And then, Michael, I'm seeing your screen, right? If you could start at 1 minute and 9 seconds, that would be great.
I was just going to say something really quickly, how masculinity is usually presented in opposition to femininity, and how femininity is the standard. Like it is like, okay, so this is like for women. And then when it comes to masculinity, it's like, okay, guys, just do the opposite. And like, you'll be well off, like you'll be fine and it'll be great. So just kind of like how, like taking the song that was like the original, like feminist song, and then like making basically like the parody out of it. So like there was that feminine standard. And then, okay, so what can we do to completely like tear this apart, trash it, and make it masculine? So just, yeah, constantly being in opposition to femininity is what solidifies masculinity, at least like socially.
Great point, Tia. I guess we can play this commercial now, Michael, please.
Ways big. Yo, men, and small. I am strong. I am strong. But some is not enough.
It's not how we treat each other, okay? Okay.
Because the boys watching today will be the men of tomorrow.
So, I don't know if anyone remembers the backlash that came out after this commercial was aired, but it was pretty insane. A lot of people were like very angry at it. Um, but if anyone would like to point out like anything in that video or anything they remember from like the reactions.
I feel like it kind of took away the notion that of the saying like boys will be boys. For young boys' behaviors to be called out and trying to correct them is not necessarily unheard of, but you're used to boys playing rough or like oh, they're just fighting, he's a boy, he needs to stand up for himself and fight back. So and for adult men to step in and try to break up those instances goes against what people expect of young boys and men and adult men. Yeah, going along with that, Tia, like watching the video, it was like, okay, like when boys like get hurt, it's like, oh, brush it off, you'll be okay. But like in the video, like what I personally seen or interpreted as is like the father figures in their life was like, okay, like get up, like are you okay? Like how are you doing? Like it was more so like trying to like see if they were okay rather than just, oh, brush it off, you'll be fine. Just brush it off.
I think was somebody else good? No. I think the backlash that they received also just reinforced why like masculinity is such like it's such a taboo to talk about. The fact that they were bashed for actually making a really good commercial and going a different path just speaks to why it's much needed.
I was going to say that I talked about this commercial in one of my marketing classes last year, actually. And we really dove into it and talked about how Gillette, like this multi-million-dollar company, used their platform for good. And that's just so important. I think it also goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about role models. At the end of the commercial, they say like, the boys of today will like be the men of tomorrow. And it's so important that they have these positive role models in their life. And it's also important the representation that was shown throughout the commercial, that there are so many different types of men. And I think even the dad and the little girl telling the little girl, you are strong, because women are not seen as strong. We're seen as these fragile little things. And I think that's just like so important.
Yeah, this commercial is actually one of my favorite commercials. If you all have the chance to watch it all the way through, I really highly recommend it. And I think it would be we could practice the mindful masculinity by sharing this on our own social media platforms, because this commercial does a great job of like destroying social constructs of what masculinity is. And like, I remember the first time I watched it, I got so emotional because it's such a beautiful video. And it really does demonstrate that destroying toxic masculinity. And so I think that we should all share it.
I couldn't agree more. I think if we all maybe even like pointed out the toxic things in the media today, like that would be a way to be more mindful. But thank you all for your comments about these commercials. And next slide.
Okay. Aside from like entertainment, I think masculinity is also constructed by our friends and family. I found a nice, documentaries, because I love documentaries, to The Mask You Live In. And The Mask You Live In highlights how culture narrows the view of masculinity and the impact that it has on all everyone, regardless of like the gender, the race, or their sexuality. And hopefully our video plays. No.
I'm pulling it up right now.
Thank you. I think I want to play the first 30 seconds.
Stop crying. Don't cry. You need to pick yourself up. Don't be weak. Always keep your mouth shut. Nobody likes a tattletale. Bros, don't let you women run your life, all right? Be a man. Be a man. Do something. So man up. Man up. Man up. Man up. Act like a man. Be a man. We've constructed an idea of masculinity that doesn't give young boys a way to feel secure, so we make them go prove it all the time.
Each of them is posturing based on how the other boys are posturing, and what they end up missing is what they each really want, which is just that closeness.
From middle school, I had 4 really close friends and we did everything together. Once I kind of went into high school, I struggle finding people I can talk to about things because I feel like I have to deal with it myself. I'm not supposed to get help.
Our kids.
Did you want me to play the whole thing or did you want me to pause it?
Nope, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Does anybody have a reaction that they want to share? Have anybody ever watched the documentary?
I've used this documentary in several groups I've done with teenage boys and presented to community members around the topic of violence and masculinity. It's kind of like a watershed moment for like what to use. It's still it's 5 years old, but it still holds up in a lot in many different ways.
I think for me, what it speaks to a lot of is kind of that learned behavior and that great divide, especially, you know, going through school, how there's a certain point in time where, you know, at age 4 and 5, little boys might be running around holding hands, but once they hit like 10 or 12, that's you can't do that anymore. Boys don't do that. Girls at that age are still, you know, they're still, you know, physically touching each other. They're, you know, touch is still a big thing that can go on. And for boys, it's no, because it becomes that no homo, because we don't want to be sissies, we don't want to be queers, we don't want to be perceived that way because that makes us less than. We've got to be rugged and strong, and boys don't show affection like that. We show affection if it's physical. We're punching each other, we're, you know, we're shoving each other, we're giving each other a hard time. And it's, again, back to that whole violence that we use to show our emotions. And we don't actually ever get to experience those emotions properly at that age when you're nothing but emotions. And to really kind of process those correctly, you don't ever really get that chance. And yeah, I think that whole segment, I loved how it just cycles through from very little to being, you know, much older. You know, it's constant. It's always there all the way through your life.
Kevin, you have a question. How do the teen? Oh, he responded. Never mind. The question was, how do teens in your group respond to the documentary?
So I realized I thought I was just talking to Professor. The groups for a long time, and so when this video came out, it was a long time coming, and it's an hour and a half, so I couldn't always use it in every single group I used, but I used bits and pieces, and it would often be a lot of boys who would find a story or one of the boys or the story or the examples in the movie and connect to themselves somehow, and that was always pretty eye-opening because as I mentioned in the chat, it's often this. In my opinion, I've watching a lot of videos about this topic. This movie tends to not really attack the way some men who are averse to this conversation are often feel attacked for the masculinity. And this movie, I feel like, doesn't quite do that, which is a good thing because it draws in versus calls out in some ways. And if you ever think there's a movie called Misrepresentation that the same creator of this movie made 2011 that addresses women gentrification in media. It's the same kind of not message, but same, I guess, idea in some ways.
Thank you. Anybody else want to share out? No. Yeah, one thing that I like about this video is that it actually forced me to think about where my ideas of masculinity come from. And like I had to sit in my mess for a minute and think like, why do I think like this? Why do I say men aren't trash? Like, why do you think that, and what's going on with you? So it forced me to bring it in, like Kevin said. And I think that it also forced me to come up with ways to practice mindful masculinity. And I think I practiced it more in my relationship now that I actually did watch this video for class. And I think I want to have a small group discussion on ways that we can all contribute to mindful masculinity in our everyday life. Can I get the next slide, please? I think we don't have to go into a small breakout group because we have nice discussions in a big breakout group too. So if anybody have any ideas they want to share about how to be more mindful of masculinity in our everyday lives. Or even if you already do, like what are some ways that you practice?
Well, I definitely recommend reading For the Love of Men by Liz Plank. It's an incredible book. If you haven't read it already, definitely pick it up. It's an eye-opener and a very intimate approach into having that introspective conversation with yourself and on masculinity and, you know, the messaging that society has on masculinity, and definitely pick it up and read it if you haven't read it already.
Can I back on Michael's great suggestion of advice and look into the book The Will to Change by Bell Hooks? It single-handedly changed my perspective on the approach to how we talk about this topic as from a like domination superiority complex. Yeah, Bell Hooks in general is awesome, so that's kind of a given, but The Will to Change is a great book about men, masculinity, and love as well.
Going off of that, I read All About Love by Bell Hooks, and I think that would be like the perfect book for everyone. I think everyone should be required to read that book. It's like one of my favorites.
Can we drop some book suggestions and start a book club? Everybody's doing it now.
I was going to say, if you do have book suggestions, go ahead and throw them in the chat, and because since we're recording this, we'll post it to our website, and we'll add the book list as well as the video clips that we've had tonight in there, so if people want to check those out later. And now I guess I'm speaking to the people who are watching this after the fact. But kind of going back to your question of how we can, you know, practice this, bring this into our everyday lives. I think definitely, especially for those of us who are men, you know, leading by example, you know, demonstrating this in our daily lives, you know, making this a part of who we are, and we share that out, you know, without fear, especially to, you know, the young men and, you know, men in our lives that, you know, we either mentor or work with or have interactions with. I think, you know, when my nephews were much younger, they're in their 20s now, which makes me feel really old, but you know, definitely making it clear to them, you know, like it's okay, you know, if you feel a feeling, you can express that feeling. You know, if you want to hold hands, we can hold hands. That's not, you know, this is how you can show affection with somebody, you know, in a platonic sense, and that, you know, it's okay to do those sorts of things. And I think also just, and I hate using the word normalize, but, you know, making it more normal, I guess, that, you know, you can live outside of this idea of what a masculine world looks like. You know, it's like, you know, yes, I have a beard, I like beards, but, you know, that does not necessarily mean that I am hyper masculine. And that, you know, I also don't like to knit, which is not necessarily a masculine trait, but I do love to knit. And I think that's okay. And I think more people should do that.
Kevin said to be more careful about holding hands because COVID. Okay, thank you for sharing out. I think that I really like that the book addresses the implications of like how society narrows masculinity and it creates like anxiety. So I really like that majority of our audience are social workers, especially people who identify as men that are social workers. So I think that's really important, especially for the future of young children. I think that's really cool. Any more reactions, or people want to share how they practice mindful masculinity?
I was just gonna say I kind of wrote in the chat, but a way to be more mindful is to continue to check our assumptions at the door, as well as continue to be more understanding and compassionate with one another, and validating each other's feelings, because I feel like that's how we open up more. And shout out to all the social workers. I'm a social work major, so yeah, shout out to you guys. But yeah, just validating each other's feelings, making everybody just feel important, and that's a key thing. I feel like that also, it just ties along with everything, and it makes people feel more compassionate with each other and be more open with each other. So yeah.
I was thinking too, like kind of going off Faith's point about, you know, I'm not a man, so like just myself being more aware of maybe imposing like social norms and gender expectations onto men. Like, you know, would I judge him if he did that if he was a woman or if he was non-binary? So like just kind of like being aware where my own biases are coming from, and you know, like if I would judge a man differently if he was somebody else or identify differently, you know, like, well, why is that? And, you know, we need to maybe unpack that a little bit. So just being more aware of like my own biases and stuff like that.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I haven't spoken yet, but a lot of us men are undoing masculinity or unbecoming a man and what we've been taught. And it does take time. And it takes people in your lives to really listen and be vulnerable and open up. And so one way to help out is to create space, to create a time, and to let, for me, it's been helpful for friends just to let me feel, and let me unbecome, and let me try things out, right? And so that's been really helpful. And then I don't know if anyone in here has children, but mindful masculinity with children. I'm a divorced father of 2, and I get to practice in my own home, both feminine and masculine, both caring and nurturing and holding and creating space for both of my children, to be vulnerable with them, to cry in the shower when I need to. And so there's a lot of things that I have learned as a divorcee, and carrying both that masculine and femininity within me, that has been extremely important, extremely helpful for my kids, that I wouldn't necessarily wouldn't be at today if I hadn't gone through a divorce, if I hadn't unbecome, if I haven't had the time to actually start practicing those aspects of my identity and exploring that. So honestly, it's been really helpful to just unbecome and have that time, and then practice it with my children.
That's amazing. I was going to say thanks about the child thing too. In a sense, like men and boys are very similar, where toxic masculinity is reinforced and perpetuated by violent negative reinforcement. So thinking of not only like, it's one thing to go and call out men on the street who are doing stupid things, because that's going to take you all day long. It's going to be a long job. You're never going to get it done. If to not only do that, I guess, when we feel necessary, but also when your friends, your male friends, male identified friends are doing good masculine things, or whatever you want to word that anyways, is reinforcing that by praising them and saying that's really awesome, and validating that, because men are kind of simple sometimes, and they like being told, like, you know, here's a cookie for doing something good. So
Thank you both for sharing. It really means a lot.
Yeah, thank you all. Thanks for sharing all your ideas. And I think we're done with our discussion.
So to wrap things up, we will be going over the major takeaways from this workshop. This will ensure that you have the tools and resources necessary to live your day-to-day life, being mindful and aware of masculinity and the ways in which it is presented and showcased in society. Toxic masculinity is the idea that certain stereotypes of what men are supposed to be or act like can be toxic or harmful to oneself. This can include being aggressive, dominant, and violent. If a man doesn't behave in these ways, then he may be judged for it, even if these behaviors are problematic. It is important to educate people about toxic masculinity so that they are aware of these behaviors. The easiest way for people to understand these concepts is to explain the concept in simple terms, as it can sometimes be difficult to understand. So how can we work to eliminate toxic masculinity? One way we can do this is by challenging and rejecting social constructs that support it. And you can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So some constructs to be aware of and challenge are the idea that emotions make you weak. Emotions are an important and integral part of our lives. So it is important to recognize that it is healthy to have and show these emotions. And then the idea of physicality and strength as being defining. You do not need to be overly buff in order to be strong. All bodies are strong bodies, and the strength of your character and heart is so much more important than how much you can bench or if you have a six-pack. And then finally, the idea of men having to fulfill authority roles. Men don't always have to be in charge of everything. It is perfectly okay for men to look to others for help or guidance, as we've already kind of talked about earlier. It does not make them any less of a man not to be in charge or to listen to another man or woman. Remember to be on the lookout for these and other toxic social constructs to avoid using or supporting them and help others confront them so that slowly we can break down toxic masculinity. And then here on the slide, you can see that some people to look to as examples and inspirations on rejecting social constructs are James Charles, Sam Smith, and then Liz Plank. And we have their social media handles there if you want to check out their pages. And then another important takeaway that we want you all to have from this workshop is that we would like everyone to remember to continue to create safe spaces for men, especially young men, so they are mindful of their masculinity and the different forms of masculinity in the communities that surround them. So we can take some of the tips discussed in this workshop to be more mindful, excuse me, such as be respectful of people's privacy and confidentiality. Let people share with you and don't go and share their information. Just let them come and let them share. And then check yourself. Let go of your preconceived notions of what normal is and let others express themselves without judgment. In addition to these things, be kind to yourself. Allow yourself to be the person you vision yourself to be. Lastly, in order to create a safe space, you have to educate yourself. What is toxic masculinity? Do you recognize toxic masculinity in your day-to-day life? How can you become more aware? I'm sure that we can learn some things from all of you guys. So does anyone have any examples of a safe space that they have experienced and or like if they have created that safe space, and how did that safe space make you feel? And then you guys can just share, unmute and share if you want. Okay, well, I actually have a personal one that I want to share. So I have a 6-year-old sister, and her name is Lucy. And then she often she shares with us that she wants to be a boy, or like she prefers to do boy things just in boy ways. And like I'm so proud of my dad because he his go-to phrase with my sister. I'm sorry. Can you guys hear me? Sorry. His go-to phrase with my sister is to let her express herself. Like he never judges her. He always comes from a place of love. And I don't know, I just feel like it's really comforting to see that in my own home with my own sister, like my dad reacting that way. So does anybody else have, and it can be totally different. Does anybody have any examples of safe spaces?
I think just kind of like your dad setting that example, just being, supportive of people when they do come to you. And because it takes a lot for people to open up, especially about it, just to be vulnerable in general. So being very supportive of them, and if you're going to judge them, wait till later to judge them. If you absolutely have to judge them, but just being yeah, just listening, I think, and not too quick to jump in, like, well, why did you do that? Or why do you feel that way? You know, just kind of like letting them go at their own pace and sort of reading the situation so you can respond, you know, appropriately rather than just going off your first thought and you just kind of, and it could kind of like ruin like the mood or the person's experience, and then they might close back up or whatever. And I also just wanted to say that I really love the second point about the idea of physicality and strength as being defining, because, and before you read it out loud, I hadn't thought about how ableist like the idea of masculinity could be,
Right.
Because some people have different conditions that prevent them, you know, from looking a certain way or doing certain things, and that is too overlooked in our society. So I just want to say shout out to you for like including it there.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm really glad that like drove home for you that point. Thank you for sharing. So then, does anybody else?
Yeah. Finding your people and those few people who you can actually talk about these issues with, as well as who will call you out on your shit.
Yeah.
Something important.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Something important that I have learned is that when people are in extremely vulnerable situations, I try not to ask questions and just let them make sure that they know that they can tell me as much or as little as they want, whatever they feel comfortable with. And I think that serves as an opportunity to let someone be fully vulnerable and not close themselves off or feel defensive in any way.
Yeah, I think that's very, very important, because you don't want to come on too strong, and you don't want to force someone to share something they're not ready to share, but being that outlet and letting them know that you're a safe space for them is just like more important.
And I'm sure HR is about to say something very poetic and just like completely.
I don't know about poetic. I think definitely I agree with all of these, and I love these examples. And Elizabeth, thank you for sharing that story about your little sister and your dad. I think that's fantastic. Snaps to your dad for that. I think that's awesome. I wish more parents were like that. Just kind of letting people express themselves and be themselves and figure themselves out. I think that's wonderful. But I think definitely, to the point that was made about, finding your group, your people, I think is definitely true. And, I think of an example of a friend of mine. We've been friends for 40 some years. And, we have very honest conversations with each other about, he's straight, I'm gay, but, we still have conversations about like, what's it like being a man, like, how do we define that? And, I think that's good conversations to have with each other as men, and even with women, those conversations. And, I think it also leads to that, I think it's important to call out bad behavior, but I also think it's important to call people in to those conversations to say, okay, well, that wasn't a great behavior, but let's talk about that. And, that I think of an example of another friend of ours, what precipitated that conversation about what is toxic masculinity. We had a mutual friend who is transitioning, is transmasculine, and at the time was super excited that, was passing and people were identifying him as a man. And I applaud that. I was totally on board with that. But he also started to pick up really terrible toxic masculine habits. And we were like, yeah, we need to have a conversation. And that was, for us, that was a way to call out and then call in and be like, we've been friends for 20 some years. Have you ever seen either of us exhibit those behaviors? And he's like, no, but, and it goes back to, what do we see in the media? What have we been taught? And that was kind of the examples that he was drawing upon to kind of define his own masculinity. And, it was a great conversation for the three of us to have about what does masculinity mean, and how do we want to exhibit that? And I thought, it was such a great opportunity to have that conversation in a not judgmental way, but in a very constructive way.
Right. And it's like your example shows the importance of having those close people where like maybe you ask the wrong question, but like that you're in a judgment-free zone, and like that's the best part of having someone that you can go to.
And I'll add another one as well. Just creating a safe space for yourself, and that is a time of reflection and a time of feeling and a time of understanding your own identity and your own gender and thinking through that, and being okay to share that conversation with yourself, or to like go there, I think is really important, and that takes time and effort. But yeah, creating that safe space for yourself.
Exactly. All right, so just to continue with the presentation, don't be afraid to admit that you do not know everything, and be willing to say, I am still learning, and there are things that I am not going to get right, but I am committed to doing better. Every man must be invited into the conversation, and although we will never be able to get everything right, opening the door to the conversation of inclusion is a step in the right direction. So does anybody have any final comments or questions about this workshop?
I just have a quick question. Like how, like anybody can just answer this question, but like how do you reconstruct what the media has showed what masculine should be like?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I'm also putting in the chat for you guys. How do you reconstruct what the media has showed what masculine should be like?
Watch Schitt's Creek.
Yeah.
That's it.
I think like an important, something important is just to like maybe point out like the toxic masculinity or like things that are like normalized in the media, and then talk about like what you can do better.
Yeah, and I think I mean, yeah, definitely acknowledge it and confront it when you see it. And a few other folks have mentioned, making it your own, and to use, Derek, he checked out, I think, but to use his words, salt and pepper it, season it and make it your own. I thought that was awesome. I really dug that.
I think being mindful of the media that you're consuming too, like who are you following on social media, especially on platforms like Twitter or Reddit. You will find lots of subreddits of just some thoughts on masculinity that aren't necessarily the most healthy, right? So I think I'm saying that in a very nice way, but it's so true. Just being careful of where you go on the internet, and also just seeking out new sources of information too. So if you haven't read anything from Out or The Advocate, maybe check out them, or check out something. Check out one of the educational engagements at your local LGBTQ center. So being mindful of where you're getting your information to.
Mm-hmm. All right.
It looks like Tia.
So yeah.
Sorry. She said, man, my computer is bad. Okay, she said, responding to the earlier prompt, make sure you're able to receive certain information. I know I have to be in the right headspace to have heart-to-hearts because I take on feelings, my friends, and family. So just making sure you're able to take in info. That's very true. That is very true. And then Professor Wagman said, as a parent, I also try to talk with kids about problematic gender representation in pop culture, but we also try to find graphic novels, cartoons, films that subvert these norms. Another list we could try.
Yeah, I agree. I think the media like has so much craziness in the world. And I think listening to the lived experience of people can be very beneficial to like our personal growth as well as like how we interact with other people. So I feel like lived experiences and listening to people's stories and memoirs are very good at creating a safe space and even growing within yourself.
Yeah. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight for this workshop. We really appreciate the conversation, the openness, the safe space that you all have been able to provide. And so, yeah, that concludes our workshop. But if you guys have any questions or comments, feel free to email HR or Michael at the LGBTQ Center. And yeah, we will hopefully continue to be in touch. Thank you guys for coming.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your kind words. Have a wonderful evening, guys.
Thank you so much for the presentation. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming tonight.
Are we just supposed to leave?
Thank you so much, everyone. You did a great job. Thank you. Thank you for your work.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you so much.
Take good care, everyone.
All of your work too.
You too, bye.
Some good, better days before us. Take care, everyone.
Definitely.